Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure for both of us to be here with you in this ASCAS project and discussing a bit the ideas we develop in further detail in our chapter on Central Asia and the terrorist question. I'm Maria Raquel Freire. I'm a lecturer, a professor in international relations at the Faculty of Economics of the University of Coimbra. I'm also a researcher at the Center for Social Studies of the same university, and my research interests have focused mainly on foreign policy, international security, and a lot on Russia and post-Soviet space, where of course Central Asia and Central Asian republics after the demise that became independent after the demise of the Soviet Union have been also the focus of my attention and my research work.
Hello, I'm Bernardo Fazendeiro. I'm currently a lecturer in international relations at the Faculty of Economics at the University of Coimbra. Part of my research interests is general international relations theory, but with a specific focus on Central Asia. I'm also a researcher at the Center of Social Studies. I also want to thank for this opportunity to present you a summary of our findings and what we have to say about international security and terrorism. Basically today we're going to be talking about international security and terrorism, specifically focused on the case of Central Asia. Now, Central Asia is an interesting case, and perhaps the example we use in the chapter and about which we want to talk about now, it helps clarify why looking at terrorism as the primary international security concern in Central Asia is so important. So to do that, I'll just give you one small example. Basically 20 masked individuals in November 2019 attacked a group of cyclists who were traveling in Tajikistan. Now what's interesting about this case is that the government of Tajikistan in Dushanbe immediately said that this was the Islamic State. However, some international press sources weren't as convinced and argued that perhaps it was something else, perhaps it was a group of criminals, or perhaps it wasn't even the Islamic State, it was some other organization. However, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization quickly accepted the government of Tajikistan's version of events and also claimed that it was a terrorist act. And as the events continued to be discussed afterwards, it wasn't entirely conclusive as to who might have been responsible for the attacks, especially because prior to this incident, Tajikistan had already been blamed by some international observers for having categorized certain groups as terrorists when in fact it might not have been so. Now what's interesting about all of this is two things. First of all, the extent to which Central Asia has been gradually perceived through the lens of terrorism, especially when we look at international security. And this is interesting in and of itself, and how did this happen? And also why, to a certain extent, despite the extent to which terrorism and Central Asia go together, why some people, like press sources, academics, and so forth, have increasingly become wary of using this concept to describe certain groups, events within Central Asia. So the purpose of our talk right now is more or less to discuss what terrorism is. So that's our first starting point. And we'll see once we discuss the concept in of itself, it tells us little about why it became so problematic in Central Asia. So what we want to do afterwards is then discuss why the concept itself became associated with Central Asia, and we'll see that the reason for this has mainly to do with the fact that Central Asian actors themselves, leaders, politicians, and so forth, use the concept a lot for a variety of reasons, which we'll discuss about in a bit, and also partly because international observers themselves, especially after September 11, 2001, quickly used the concept as a way in which to describe the region and to justify their actions in the region. And so once we go over this kind of small history as to why the concept of terrorism became so associated with Central Asia, the next thing we'll talk about is why this might be problematic. So basically what we want you to take out of this video and this chapter, once you come to reading it, is the caution that you should use, the caution you should take when using the concept of terrorism upon describing Central Asia. Okay? So without much further ado, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Professor Raquel Freire.
Security studies are clearly, regarding this topic, a very important area, and we thought it would be interesting, although we do not have enough time to get in depth into security studies and the various debates we find in this field of study, to give you some highlights, let's say, about how these have been evolving and where we stand. And somehow from what Bernardo was just saying when he was introducing our approach to terrorism and our approach to security studies also, we clearly go beyond the more simpler state-centered narratives that are very much characteristic of realism. We don't totally dismiss these because, of course, states are key actors still, but we look at other security theories that bring other actors and other dimensions to the study of international terrorism, to the study of international issues related to security. And so we engage with critical readings of security. So when we talk about a certain label or be attentive to the kind of language that is used regarding issues like terrorism, this points to these different strands in the literature that are beyond these more traditional readings about international security. So it's interesting the way security studies have been evolving, and if you think of the period of the Cold War, where there was this rivalry between the two superpowers, and security was very much focused on realpolitik, right? In the rivalry between the two superpowers, and nuclear power was very much at the center. So when you look at publications during this period of the Cold War regarding security, there's a lot focusing on what was considered, these high issues on security, very much related to nuclear issues and to the two superpowers. And it's very interesting because there are, of course, other dimensions of security that were already present even at the time of the Cold War, but that were clearly hidden by this concentration or over-concentration on topics related to hard security, military power, arms races, and so on. So this kind of hard security. And I think the best and most interesting example is probably the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. And this is a format at that time still a bit informal, that is negotiated between the Soviet Union, the United States, Western European states, and also the satellite states that were under the influence of the Soviet Union at the time, and all meet around the same table to discuss security issues. And what is most interesting about this, the dynamic process that evolves from the Helsinki Final Act, is that in the wording of this document, you can already see clearly references to what we now call human security or environmental security or even economic security. So the Decalogue, which is how we call the Helsinki Final Act document, as references to these dimensions as essential in terms of its security outlook. And this means, of course, that there were already discussions around these topics, but they kept, let's say, subsumed to the more military power discussions and the association of security studies to strategic studies, to military studies, and very much focused on that. And it will be when the Cold War is over and then the Soviet Union collapses and we have these huge changes in the international system, right? The bipolar rivalry gets to an end and we see the drawing of something new, or at least something different. And at this time it's very interesting because there's a school of thought, let's put it a security studies school, the Copenhagen School, who will systematize very much this issue about the need to enlarge the security focus. And then we will have these sectoral approaches to security that the Copenhagen School advances and that have to do with, political security, economic security, societal security, environmental security, and of course military security. And basically what these scholars are telling us is that we should look at security from these diverse perspectives and enlarge our concerns with security beyond the military realm. Otherwise, we have a too reductionist approach to security. So the Copenhagen School is somehow innovative to the extent that it systematizes, right, these sectoral approaches to security, but it's not so innovative in the sense that these conceptualizations of security already existed and were out there, and the example I gave a while ago I think is very good in illustrating these dynamics, but clearly put it in a different context, right, and made it more easily perceptible and also more operational in terms of how we could even work with these conceptualizations of security, because we work in a totally different context. So the Copenhagen School of Security Studies is known for widening security studies, and then we have the Welsh School of Security Studies that is connected with what we call a deepening of security studies. And basically the Welsh school tries to draw the attention to the fact that so looking at these different dimensions, we also have to look at the different actors that are involved in security matters. And what this school draws our attention to is that the individual is an important referential for international security. And so when we talk about international security, we should kind of deepen the concept beyond a state-centric approach, because Copenhagen, despite broadening, it's still very much criticized for still being quite state-centric in its approaches, although it foresees societal security, but still quite state-centric. So the Welsh school brings in, for example, human security with a much stronger emphasis, and drawing our attention to look at human fluxes and how human security and the provision of human security is so important in terms of how we deal with international security. And so we have these two schools, which are complemented by a third school, which is the Paris School of International Studies. And the Paris School is clearly, as far as we see it, as brings in an added element. And it looks more at the operationalization, if we want, of these new ways of approaching and looking at international security. And so the authors from the Paris School will, for example, look a lot at migration and how this might pose a threat, an international threat, and then they will look into the ways we respond to this kind of threat. And so politics of surveillance, for example, or facial recognition, how technology is used in daily affairs to foster and to respond to security goals. And so it gets into, let's say, the ways we can operationalize and the consequences, the implications of how we deal with security, bringing in very much this technological dimension, which is quite interesting, particularly nowadays in terms of how we look at security. So this is, broadly speaking, how we can sketch the evolution in security studies and how different schools of thought have been positioning themselves. These are not self-excluding, that's for sure. So these authors and the Copenhagen, Welsh and Paris schools of security studies clearly complement each other in the ways they approach security issues and in the ways they try to go beyond more traditional and rigidified readings about international security and look also at what we call more critical issues, where labeling is so important, where the use of language is so important, and the case we will explore regarding Central Asia clearly is an exemplification, an illustration of how we can use a certain kind of label to lead to a certain goal or a certain objective.
Having discussed a bit of what we consider to be security studies, hopefully now you understand that there are many ways through which to understand international security nowadays. There are basically the typical security military perspectives with which we study security, and then we have security broadened with the purpose of which is to demonstrate how concepts become used by certain actors to make something more dangerous or a matter of security in of itself. And as we shall see, terrorism was obviously one of the concepts that became incredibly used in Central Asia to talk about security issues, okay? So, obviously this begs a question as to what is terrorism. So, a classical definition by Richard English is, for example, that terrorism involves heterogeneous violence, use or threatening of a political aim. It possesses an important psychological dimension, producing terror or fear among a directly threatened group, in the hope of maximizing political communication and achievement. It also represents a subspecies of warfare, and as such, it can form part of a wider campaign of violent and non-violent attempts at political leverage. So as you can see, this is a pretty broad understanding of what terrorism is, and it is actually important to categorize and define well what terrorism is, because it is so widely used nowadays as a concept. It is widely used in Central Asia, but in Europe, North America, Africa, and so on. So basically, a few things that we should bear in mind is that when we talk about terrorism, when we talk about this in the chapter briefly, we should be cautious about using the term in such a way that we're talking more about an action. So terrorism involves a specific type of actions more so than a group. Of course, we then use those actions to describe a group, but groups, especially groups who are engaged in armed struggle, can employ a variety of subspecies of warfare, as Rudy mentioned in Richard English's definition, which doesn't necessarily have to be terrorism. They can use guerrilla warfare, in which case they don't attack citizens as civilians and so on. They don't. Their objectives in that regard are more military and tactical in the sense that they want to defeat an enemy in battle or without direct engagement. So basically, groups can use a variety of tactics. Terrorism being one of them. So let's try now to basically segment and divide a bit of Richard English's definition and try to understand basically what are then the baseline features of terrorist action. Well, one thing we should bear in mind is that it encompasses the use of violence with a political intent. So basically, not any type of horrific violence can be categorized as terrorism. Okay? If there is no political intent, then we cannot argue that this is terrorism. The violence has to have a political intent. Okay. Of course, what is a political intent can be an object of a much wider discussion, which we don't have time to do here. So there's a degree of arbitrariness to this definition, in the sense that, what's political in one context can be apolitical in another. But so long as we agree on what is the basis of what this political intent is, then we could argue if violence is used to achieve that this is one, not the only one, features of terrorism. A second thing, because obviously there are other forms of political violence, and terrorism isn't the only one, guerrilla warfare being another. The another baseline feature is that it is applied, and this is a key thing of what makes terrorism, mainly to horrify, in such a way as to convey a message to a broader audience, insofar as the victims of an attack are less important than the symbolism they engender. So this is basically a convoluted way of saying the following. So when terrorists attack, and they attack, and their goal is to horrify, and so the victims that they choose are precisely used in such a way as to convey that horrific message. Okay. What does this mean? This means, for example, that when an armed group attacks a group of soldiers, perhaps killing them, this isn't necessarily terrorism, because they defeated the soldiers in order to capture a fort, in order to decrease the number of enemy soldiers, and so forth and so on. So the goals there are tactical, they aren't necessarily to horrify. But when a group, for example, attacks unarmed civilians who are not expecting an attack, for example, the goal here, the use of the civilians themselves on a tactical level are probably insignificant. What matters is the fact that they were killed, they weren't expecting to be killed, and people therefore are horrified that this happens. So this sends a broader message to an audience saying, if you perhaps don't do what we say, we will do this again. So it's the symbolism here that matters, more so than the tactical use that the objects of the killing have. Okay? And this is what we have to bear in mind when we talk about terrorism. Okay? The victims themselves are more symbolic than they are necessarily important from a tactical point of view. Now, why do groups engage in armed struggle decide to employ these tactics? What are the goals they have in mind when they engage in this type of activity? Well, there are several. Okay, and again, these tactics, terror tactics, can be used in combination with many other types of violence. Okay, so bear in mind that one actor can be a guerrilla fighter and also a terrorist and so on. Okay, but anyway. What are the goals that an actor might have when he decides to enact this type of violence? Well, one is to ensure that the domestic and international attention remains concentrated on the struggle. So since terrorist acts are full of symbolism because they horrify us, that also means that they usually, we pay attention to them. And so terrorist acts might be important in order for people to pay attention to what's happening. If we don't have horrific acts of violence, unfortunately, people might not pay attention. So that's one of the goals. Of course, we could obviously discuss whether this is useful in the end, because maybe we're so horrified by these acts that even if we're paying attention, we won't become sympathetic with the group. In any case, this is part of a broader discussion of whether about terrorism pays off in the end or not. And we're not having this discussion now, we're just bearing in mind the goals they have. A second goal they might have, on top of gaining international attention, might be to force an adversary to respond violently and callously, with recourse to more means than is necessary, such that it compromises political and moral standing. What does this mean? So by performing a horrific act, a terrorist group hopes that the other actor, the government or whatnot, the state, or another group against which it is struggling, that it will also respond violently, perhaps even more violently than the terrorist. And in this case, the terrorist, the group who initially did the horrifying act, might gain the moral high ground and say, okay, we did something horrible, but you guys are just as horrible, if not more horrible than us. Okay? So, given the symbolism and the nature of the horrific acts that terrorism usually is associated with, this might be one of the goals, to force the other actor to look as bad as we do. So if we initially looked at this actor, this government and this state as being a beacon of freedom and so forth, by attacking it, we try to reveal the darker truths of that actor, just to make it as brutal as we are, or to basically reveal that the brutality was always there. Another thing might be as simple as to frighten an enemy into submission. Okay? By persistently engaging in these acts, you could argue that a certain group of people and so on will gradually become wary, exhausted, and will perhaps lose all incentives to continue fighting, because it hits basically the general population's morale if these types of acts keep on being conducted. So the third goal might just be that, to frighten an enemy into submission, to force the enemy that if you keep on fighting against us, we'll continue to engage in these acts, so at least accede to our demands, or if anything, bring us into the negotiating table. A fourth one might be simply to strengthen the distinction between enemy and friend, to the effect of polarizing a given political community. What does this mean? Well, let's imagine that we're in a relatively peaceful situation, there is conflict, there's a degree of antagonism, but the general populace, the general population, is unsure as to who it should support in a given political struggle. By engaging in terrorism, by perhaps doing something horrific, we eventually force people to take sides. So we polarize the distinctions. If there perhaps was no struggle before, by doing something horrific, now people are forced to take a position. So terrorism helps polarize the debate. Okay? There are people now supporting this movement, and now there are people who are not supporting this movement. There is basically, terrorism forces people to recognize that there is a struggle, that there is a war going on. And that's why it is done, and that's why the symbolism behind terrorism is so important. Okay? So basically we have four goals that we could argue that terrorist actions can perhaps engender. To gather attention, to force people to respond, to force an enemy into submission, or to foster conflict in the first place. Okay? And as we shall see, this is something that lots of groups have been using throughout history. So terrorism, these types of frightening, horrific tactics are not new. Now, what is perhaps important to bear in mind is that these types of tactics and goals gained widespread attention, especially after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Something about which my colleague will talk about in a bit.
So as Bernardo was just saying, terrorism, national terrorism, international terrorism is not really a new phenomenon. And in the book chapter you can find a list. We made a list of some of the conventions that have been negotiated regarding terrorist topics, which shows us this is clearly an issue of concern. But when we look at developments, of course, September 11, 2001 in the United States, the terrorist attacks on the US clearly led to a different approach to terrorism, and the global war on terrorism was declared from then onwards, which legitimized a certain kind of procedures and a certain kind of actions that we will also still discuss briefly, because this raises a lot of issues about the trade-offs between security and liberties, and raises some questions about how to deal with international terrorism. It's interesting, and going back to this idea about how we conceptualize and how we label some acts, like Bernardo was explaining. an interesting example was that if you look at how the Chechen fighters for secessionism were mentioned before the terrorist attacks in the US, usually in documents, in speeches, these were referred to as secessionists. But then after the 2001 terrorist attacks and the global war on terror and this different approach to the issue of terrorism, the Chechen secessionists were relabeled, and then we start seeing references to the Chechen terrorists. And this, of course, this change in label, this change in language has clear implications in the way the Russian state will address this insurgency and will address the counter-terrorist operations, how it will act before these groups. But what is important to underline now is how clearly from this time on this becomes a global issue and a global security concern. And it's an interesting expression of that is the United Nations Security Council resolution, which is approved in 2004 and which tells us that within this global war on terror, we are dealing with criminal acts, including against civilians, committed with intent to cause death or serious bodily injury, or taking of hostages, with the purpose to provoke a state of terror in the general public, or in a group of persons, or particular persons, intimidate the population, or compel a government or an international organization to do or to abstain from doing any act, which constitute offences within the scope of and as defined in the international conventions and protocols relating to terrorism, which are under no circumstances justifiable by considerations of a political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious or other similar nature. And so in this resolution you can see how it packs the concerns that are voiced regarding how we should address what became a global threat to international security. Central Asia becomes clearly in this regard a quite interesting case study that we will analyze a bit more in detail next.
So, once we understand that terrorism gained widespread international, if not global recognition after the 2001 September 11 attacks, to the extent that even the United Nations itself felt compelled, the Security Council in particular, to provide a definition of what terrorism is, so it gained a global outreach. It is obvious that to an extent this would affect Central Asia, and as we shall see, it did not affect Central Asia a small bit, but actually quite a bit. So if we remember the initial questions that we posed in the beginning as to why Central Asia had gradually become associated with terrorism, why the concept was so intricately connected to Central Asia, there are mainly two reasons for this. And to reiterate what was already said, the international context helped that happen, and also domestic actors themselves applied or used that international context, or if not, they also fomented it from the outset, to help that association between Central Asia and terrorism being the biggest international security concern in the region become so important. Okay, so obviously these two, the international affecting the domestic level and the domestic level affecting international, both of these feed each other. We will start with the international context, which doesn't necessarily mean that that was prior to the domestic level concern. So we're not talking about here which one was most important or not. They both feed off each other. Okay. So let's start from the view from above. So let's first bear in mind that one of the reasons why this label gradually encroached itself upon the region, one of the reasons has to do with how the region itself became described in the beginning of the 1990s. So bear in mind that once Central Asia becomes independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so the Central Asian states become independent, and once they declared independence and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's a huge discussion as to how we should understand the states in this region. And that discussion exists partly because none of these states, with the borders that they have nowadays, existed prior to the creation of the Soviet Union. So these are new states, and international actors therefore try to understand what would be the international political orientations of these states. Would they be Western friendly? Would they look toward Iran, a neighbor state? Would they perhaps face toward China? Would they still remain aligned with former Soviet states, in particular with the Russian Federation? These were questions with which a lot of people struggled in the early 1990s, partly because these states did not exist, and also because of a general misunderstanding or ignorance, really, of what these politicians and leaders in Central Asia hoped to engender in the future. Okay, so a dichotomy was quickly used in the 1990s to describe Central Asia, and as you see, this dichotomy, to an extent, helped consolidate or reproduce the association between the danger of terrorism and Central Asia. And this dichotomy was that, well, the Central Asian states, being mostly Turkic and Muslim republics, they could either follow the route, the political orientation that Turkey had followed since Turkey's independence, so a secular state despite its overriding Muslim population, or it would perhaps follow the line of political Islam, much like Iran had done since 1979, after the Islamic Republic's revolution. So there was a debate as to, and this dichotomy, which a lot of international observers started to apply in the region to describe the region, was one of the principal aims through which to describe the region. And of course, a lot of political leaders from below picked on this dichotomy and said, no, actually, we're national secular republics. We do not want to follow the route Iran did. Okay? So there was this idea that there was a secular versus the potentially non-secular alternative, and that these were real alternatives in the region, and that this is the way through which the region was described. Now, as this dichotomy was used by international observers and also appropriated by domestic actors, it is also at the same time that what we usually nowadays call Islamic terrorism started becoming more notorious and started gaining headway, especially in the middle of the 1990s and toward the late 1990s. So this seemingly neutral description of the region, the fact that these states were struggling between following a political Islam or a more secular route, quickly was an easy way with which to bridge the association between the dangers of terrorism, especially Islamic terrorism. So, to a certain extent, international observers started becoming in part concerned with Central Asia because they feared that these states could potentially, especially in Europe and the United States, could follow the route, the anti-Western route that Iran had started following since 1979. So we had to protect these states, that's how the argument or the narrative went, from terrorist encroachment, terrorists who would potentially seek to foment political Islam within the country. The other concern is that most of the Central Asian republics live near, if not live near, are near, if not also they share a border with Afghanistan. And the early 1990s, Afghanistan was embroiled in a civil war, a consequence of the Soviet Union's invasion in 1979. And that civil war gained even more attention in the international arena when the Taliban entered the conflict in the mid-1990s. And now the Taliban, as many of you probably know, promulgated a fundamentalist version of Islam and also sponsored specific international terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda being one of them. And the fact is that Afghanistan and this armed conflict was right next to Central Asia, former Soviet Central Asia's border. And it's again, if we bear in mind the dichotomy which we also talked about, and the fact that there was a civil war, and one of the actors being Islamic fundamentalists, helped, spread and reproduce the idea that Central Asia, and this idea, we're not saying that this idea was incorrect, we're just saying where this idea came from, that Central Asia was potentially under the threat of certain types of attacks, specifically terrorist attacks, sponsored by groups who were sympathetic to the Taliban. Now, these were the general narratives of the 1990s, one of many that was used to describe international security in the region. Then we have September 11th, 2001, as Professor Raquel just mentioned before. What this means is that suddenly these groups, Al-Qaeda in particular, who sponsored the attacks, if not organized also the attacks against the United States, against the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, suddenly the whole region, Afghanistan in particular, but all of Central Asia, becomes part of the global war on terror. So if you bring along these dichotomies and the spillovers of Afghanistan's conflict, we have another added concern nowadays. Afghanistan basically fell to the Taliban's control, and perhaps the same could happen to Central Asia, especially if Central Asia, the states of Central Asia failed, if they were incapable of controlling their borders and preventing these insurgents, the Taliban, or the groups with whom they were friendly from crossing the border and perhaps replicating the same in Central Asia through terrorist attacks and other forms of warfare. So the global war on terror, from the international and global point of view, reaches Central Asia. And the concern with a lot of international actors was that we had to help and assist Central Asian states to make them strong as opposed to failed states, in order to prevent them from becoming like Afghanistan had become in the mid to late 1990s. So this is basically the international view from above as to why terrorism and Central Asia, from an international security perspective, become increasingly associated. And then we have the view from below. So it is important to bear in mind that there is obviously a global international context which helps foster this association, but Central Asian actors themselves also were agents in the sense of promoting this distinction and also reproducing it. So, an important thing that is worth bearing in mind, if you look into Central Asian politics, is that this dichotomy that international observers used to understand Central Asia were sometimes fostered and actively reproduced by Central Asian actors themselves, when internally they talked about good and bad versions of Islam. And this is especially the case in Uzbekistan, but it's something that, which is the most populous Central Asian republic, but it's also a case in other Central Asian republics, as they tried to create their own national project, and especially when they started discussing amongst themselves, especially amongst the political elites, what types of political Islam, if any, they should support. And in doing so, the so-called bad versions of Islam were cast away, and we're not saying this is a good or a bad thing, it simply happened. And many of these proponents of what the government called bad versions of Islam gradually started being categorized by a lot of Central Asian leaders as terrorists. Okay? Some of them didn't necessarily sponsor terrorist acts, in the sense of using horrific acts of violence, but they were nevertheless categorized as such, as potentially terrorist groups. So bad versions of Islam increasingly start becoming associated with terrorism, even more so after September 11th. And the chapter talks about some of the groups that were cast and categorized in this way. Okay, so the internal politics and national building projects in Asian republics helped also foster this association, etc. And so this bad version of Islam is intricately connected to that crucial point that a lot of Central Asian actors use the concept of terrorism, like we talked about in that example, to cast or to categorize a particular group, or to categorize almost any type of armed struggle, especially against the government, as a terrorist act. Now, also because of the international context, so this besides the domestic political context, a lot of Central Asian actors also understood that one way to gain legitimacy from the outside and also internally was to demonstrate that they were actually themselves facing the same struggle that other international actors and states were facing at the time, especially once the global war on terror started. So from this point of view, besides the goal of casting specific political rivals aside, using the label was also a means by which to gain international recognition and legitimacy. If we are active actors in the struggle against terror, then we need your support. We need your financial support, your moral support, your political support. And it is not by any coincidence whatsoever that a lot of international organizations, groups, start paying attention to Central Asian republics in their real or imagined struggle against terrorist actors. Of course, it's important to bear in mind that these states, these republics did face a lot of threats, not just from terrorism, but they did face a lot of these threats, which is not totally imagined. But in many cases, the concept itself was appropriated more than perhaps it should have been. We'll leave you as the audience to decide once you read a chapter and as you research this more. But the fact of the matter is, given that the global context was favorable to this terrorist distinction, it was, especially from the domestic Central Asian leaders' point of view, a huge incentive to appropriate this term and also to gain visibility. Of course, as this concept was increasingly appropriated and used by domestic and international actors alike, it is obvious that it increasingly also became contested. So the current state of affairs within security studies, especially when applied to Central Asia, is growing skepticism about this use of the concept of terror and the extent to which it actually should or should not be used to describe international security concerns in Central Asia. And for that, my colleague will say a lot more.
So it is now time to start summarizing some of the main ideas we would like you to bear in mind and take into consideration when you're reading the chapter and thinking about how to approach terrorism, and in particular in the case of Central Asia. And we would like to make three main points. The first one has to do with overstating becoming the issue of terrorism, becoming a dangerous way in terms of how it advances a certain political agenda. And so, as we see it, there should be this trend to give space to discuss security issues in Central Asia beyond terrorism. So the debates are very much centered on terrorism as a security threat. So the idea would be to desecuritize terrorism in the political agenda, and this means this is a concept borrowed from the Copenhagen School, and it means that when we securitize something, we shift it from the sphere of normal politics to a sphere of exceptionality, which allows out of the normal procedures actions to be taken. And so the idea here is that we should desecuritize in order to be able to deal with other security issues that are also relevant in the context of Central Asia. A second idea has to do with the justification of authoritarianism as a means by which to provide security. And this clearly reduces the political space for pluralism, and it somehow, because of the identification of this highest concern, this highest threat, we are legitimizing the perpetuation of authoritarianism. And so this should also be a point of our attention. And a third idea has to do with setting out the basis for international recognition in exceptional times and in face of exceptional threats. And this is clearly related to the previous points that we made, and it has a lot to do also with the fact that if we attract the attention of powers like China or Russia, we gain more visibility and we gain a different recognition. And this has been very much the path through the use of terrorism, but there are other areas that should call the attention, like development aid, for example. And so we should clearly broaden the security agenda in Central Asia and diminish the prevalence of terrorism as it has been put on the agendas. So again, and Bernardo already underlined this very clearly, we are not dismissing that terrorism is not at all a concern, of course it is, but that there are other security issues that also need to have a place to be taken care of. So as a last note, we would say that the way in which labels and discourse contribute to legitimize certain political decisions is clearly very important, and we should bear in mind these dynamics and these processes when we are conducting informed analysis and informed research, in particular in the case of terrorism in Central Asia. So we just want to thank you for your attention. We hope this will be useful for your studies, for making you think a bit outside the box on these issues.
Agreed, and I hope you enjoy reading the chapter and it reveals something about the way we should think about Central Asia, international security, and terrorism.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.